Hello and welcome to the October 2018 ENSOL seminar. We're sort of just kicking off, just a couple of minutes behind schedule, but I think we should be good to go. So our speaker, this seminar kicks off the 2018-2019 series, which has a number of really exciting talks coming up, and I'm particularly looking forward to this one, actually, because I think this is our first properly developmental talk, which examines some really interesting psychological data. So our speaker for this month is Nicole Rossmanith, who is based in the University of Portsmouth. You've a background, Nicole has a background in linguistics and German and cognitive science, has worked in Krems and Tübingen, has researched and taught in the University of Vienna as well. So we're gonna sort of power through straight to Nicole's talk. So I'm very happy to introduce Nicole to talk about how infants co-create their shared worlds.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mark. So hello, everyone, and thanks that I can exchange some thoughts with you. And I'll just jump right in. And I'll talk with you about how we come to arrive at a shared object world. So a slightly complicated title, from jointly enacting affect-imbued action arcs to systemically structured sense-and-action-scapes, how infants come to co-create a shared object world to engage with. And just, Marek has already said that, just to give you a little bit of my background. So I studied in Vienna and in Tübingen, basically, and then worked in the thesis network in Portsmouth, also with secondment in San Sebastian, and now I'm actually working together also with Joanna Raszek-Leonardi and Katharina Rolfing and Iris Nomiko in the EASE project about early semantics. So how do we arrive at a shared object world we jointly act and communicate about, transform and co-create? So what do I mean by that? And just to demonstrate, I will jump right into an example.
Read a book. Would you like to read a book, Ricky? Oh, yes. What can you see? Let's give it to me. Thank you.
So here we have rich artifacts, of course, part of our object world.
Yeah, there's the bird. That's a seagull. We saw one out the window.
Words, so language is there. And you see that they're sharing this bigger world. So she said, "Where's the bird?" And he turned to the window. So that's around 12 months. So how do we actually get there? So what is it and how do we get there? Just another brief example. At 9 months. And she's doing something that she's not supposed to do. And at that point, you clearly realize she knows exactly.
Yeah, I know where you're going. All the mess over there is with you. I can get you.
And the mother is going after her in a playful way.
Gotcha.
So you see they're sharing a lot more. So they're not, they're sharing common understanding of the whole situation here. So how do we get to that point that becomes possible? So usually in cognitive science, we're very familiar with this kind of situation, with this kind of split. So cognitive science traditionally went for the so-called complex, higher cognition, complex activities, or higher cognition, so involving language or symbol use, conventional object use, tool use, some forms of collaboration, usually understood as coordinating and taking over a role in complex activity. And they were always already cast in cognitive and rational accounts. So you see here the complex, like Chomsky-like tree, in this case of Brunner depicting peekaboo, or a model of Tomasello of two people collaborating, and you see that they have the representations in their head of the whole situation and only very small hands, so everything is very knowledge-based, what's going on here. And then, of course, we have these newer approaches in cognitive science, embodiment, dynamical systems approaches, ecological psychology, who try to ground these things more generally. And of course, they're always questioned whether with these accounts we can actually get there, so the so-called scaling problems. And so the question is, what kind of concepts, what do we need to get from one to the other? And usually within development, this is thought to be what's called triadic interaction. So the ability of coordinating engagement between people and objects via visual joint attention, and mostly this is again thought to be knowledge-based. So seeing others as goal-directed agents. So we have to make this kind of means-end distinction here. So the irony here is, in a way, that in order to get there, you already have to be knowledge-based. You already have to have structured knowledge. So that makes actually accounting for development very difficult. And there really is this kind of conceptual and methodological fault line, kind of schism. So all the complex, early activities are productively addressed in terms of dynamical systems and activism, ecological psychology, and so on. After 9 months, mostly interaction is framed in terms of cognition and rationality, which again makes development difficult to account for. So if you look at the definitions of higher cognition, what many of them have actually in common is something like ability to distinguish and take into account relations between things, hence also this notion of triadicity. And now we'd like to keep that in mind and see whether we can take a fresh look at empirical data. So also to get out of this kind of conceptual cast we're usually in, and to look at the embodied, embedded, multi-level coordination dynamic between mothers, mostly mothers, caregivers, and infants during the first year of life. So sorry for the complicated slide. It's mostly 4 slides. I will walk you through just with examples. So first, the kind of coordination you see around 3 to 4 months already is participating in shared affect-imbued action arcs. So have a look at this kind of interaction.
I love this friendly kitten with a velvety soft nose. What's that? Velvety nose. That's right.
And once again, so the mother shapes everything in action arcs.
Kitten with velvety soft nose.
The infant looks up to her, and then she moves her finger. The infant is drawn back. See, the infant is very responsive, and you have a fluent coordination, and the infant is following the mother here. But they do not only show this kind of coordination, which is rather responsive. So here you see the kind of analysis I'm doing, and you see in this encircled, you see these small little action arcs which organize the interaction and provide the infant with the first form of shared global orientation structure. But they do not also respond in this kind of reactive way, but also already participate in a functional way. So here, this example is nappy change, and so from 3 months, we really see that the infants, upon a cue, when the mother opens the nappy, the infant is lifting her bottom in a helpful way, and the mother can take out the nappy. And again, this is facilitated by organizing things into an action arc. So the mother starts, "What are you doing? Are you ready? Are you ready?" Then at the peak, the infant lifts the bottom, and the mother thanks the infant, "Thank you, thank you." And at the end of the interaction, she goes, "All done." So the point I would like to make here is that this action arc really provides a kind of first organization helping the infant to orient and coordinate this interaction. So if we move from 4 to 6 months, here actually a whole repertoire of fluently practiced routines is established. Here you will see the difference in the interaction.
Der Muskel ist so stark, dass Kanonenkugeln so weit werfen kann, wie ein normaler Mensch einen Tischtennisball. Oh, so weit?
So see what
so
the difference is. The orientation is different.
Normaler Mensch einen Tischtennisball.
And again,
so weit?
the baby is drawn by the mother's voice and looks at her face. This time already she's fast enough to actually arrive at her mother's face, and they have a kind of affective exchange. And then the infant looks back mostly on her own to the book. So you see that the infant is much more oriented already and moving fluently. And also in nappy change, for example, you see differences that the mother now uses the thank you as a cue in the beginning. So she says ta, and the infant moves her bottom. One more example. Oops. Let's try again.
You want to play Big Boost? Hey, Olivia, are you going to play Big Boost? You want to play Big Boost? Come on, let's go. Yeah. Precies. Can you play? You want to play? Where's she gone? I see you. I see you. I can see you. Granny's cat. Boo. You can have a look. You can have a look. Oh, where's Olivia gone? Where's Olivia gone? Where's she gone? I can see you. I see you. Boo. 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 Peekaboo. I see you. Hey.
So here again, the whole thing is organized into the action arc. And what's new now is that the infant is really interacting with an object already, in body relative object movements, and enacting this peekaboo routine together. A little later, at 6 months, the interaction is even more sophisticated now, because she's now able to do it without any cue and with a stranger.
Oh, there she's gone. Oh, there she is again. There she is again.
So now she's trying to play with me, and she doesn't need the cue or the context. So it's mostly context independent now. She's able to do it on her own. If we move further from 6 to 9 months, we suddenly arrive at a kind of split in coordination. So on the one hand, these playful, joint, coordinated play routines, they reach a new peak. So they are very wild and funny, and they are now also very flexible. And what you begin to see now is combinatorial variation. So before already there was contour variation. So the mothers and the infants were playing with the length or the intensity of the interaction, and now they play actually with different routines and exchange some bits. So they move from one game into the other game. So in the lower picture fields, you see the mother first from a kissing game going to a peekaboo game, because the infant happens to at some point to lift her dress, and then the mother responds in a different way, and then the infant realizes, if I do that, the mother switches with me to the other routine. And so that's what they're learning now together. And the coordination moves from the habitual structure to, we can coordinate that together. On the other hand, what we see is that, especially in object routines, infants now don't enjoy interacting with the parents. Instead, they are now concentrated and guided by and guiding their attention to their own bimanual object acts. So they must need to learn to coordinate their visual attention with their object actions. Because up to now, these systems, so the attentive communicative system, like gaze and vocals, and also whole body movements used for communication, and the physically effective system, most typically manual actions, they functioned in a way separated from each other, and now they are joined together in these object actions, and infants still need to learn how to coordinate them. And therefore, this is the typical situation described by some people, that infants at around 6 months are not able to coordinate engagement with people and objects, but not as often suggested, because they can't they don't know that people are persons having goals and so on, but because they are very busy bringing together their various action streams. If we move on, what happens around 9 to 12 months? Now you find mothers and infants orienting each other across contexts and also space and time, as you have seen. And they use their own coordinates in a way to create their own contexts where they coordinate each other. And if we have a look at that video again.
You want to read a book? Would you like to read a book, Ricky? Would you? Ah, yes. What can you see? Let's give it to me. Thank you. What can you see in this one? There's the bird. Yeah, there's the bird. That's a seagull. We saw one out the window. That's right. They go out there, don't they? Outside.
So what happens here is pretty amazing. So the mother says, oh, where's the bird? And the infant, a 12-month-old, immediately turns to the window before the mother even realizes. The mother is still looking at the book. And then the mother goes on saying, oh, we saw one out of the window yesterday. And she turns, realizing that the infant was looking to the window. So here we see that this form of coordination reaches in a way to other instances of engagement. This time an engagement happening the day before, and beyond the immediate perception and action space they are sharing. And so what the infant is doing is that he is actually guiding the mother to, so enlarging that kind of perception and action space and guiding the mother to the window. So that's the empirical development we are seeing. And now the question we asked before is, how can we get from this from this kind of more simple, very effective behavior coordinated interactions to these supposedly very complex ones, these complex structures. And the idea here is that these affective action arcs actually build a kind of bridge to arrive there, because they're not only, so they are really shared, so both are immersed in the activity and acting this activity, immersed in the emotive motion, if you like. But additionally, this gives the infant an idea of the structure of the activity. And what the mothers are doing is that they map these complex interactions, which that don't necessarily mean anything to the infant. And the infant certainly also doesn't know about these goals or steps and instrumental steps to some goals yet. But by mapping these complex actions onto these embodied action arcs, which also have a kind of inherent intentionality, by mapping them onto those, the infants are able to learn and to orient. And so I tried to sketch the theoretical, so I tried to sketch theoretically the suggested development from the earliest interactions to the more complex ones that are usually associated with language, symbol use, conventional object use, or taking over roles in complex contexts. And the idea, so derived from the empirical basis, is that in the beginning they are jointly enacting these effective action arcs, and you see there's this kind of point cloud down here. So the infant is very responsive in the beginning, and so the infant's actions are broadly regulated by environmental events. So they respond, their gaze is drawn actually to each stimulus there is, whether it's the cat walking by or it's the mother pointing somewhere. So at times this can be distracting, but at times, and most of the times, this is really, really utilized by the caregivers to guide the infant, and it enables the infant to always look where something important is happening and to look where it can learn something. And they also can learn the first cues. And here you see, for example, in nappy change, they know the general structure of the interaction and they know the cue, and then something like a specific response crystallizes at the appropriate point in time. And sometimes there also is an external scaffold provided either by the structures in the environment or by the mother. If we move on, so from around 4 to 6 months, when there's this shared repertoire of routines, then through the variations, so through moving through the action arcs, which always vary a little, the invariant structures start crystallizing. And also they now learn various different routines. And now actually, so from being rather adhesive in the regulation, now the regulation of the action becomes more cohesive. So it's the action parts themselves which now crystallize, which guide the next step. So you could say the infants learn a kind of habit. So the interaction is mostly regulated by the habits and by ritual correlates. So the cues have been, which are very just the ones that happen to happen in the beginning, now are already ritualized. So they get more specific and coordinated between mother and infant, and are also used for coordination. And also at this time, we begin to see reflective joint engagement, that is contour modulation, so drawing out the interactions, as well as affective comments, for example. So in the book sharing interaction around 6 months, the infant, hearing the mother's voice, turned to the mother, and they were sharing this moment. And thereby they break up the routine, have this emotional exchange, and go back to the routine. So this is already, you could say this is a kind of sequential comment, and is also the basic, could be seen as a basic form of aboutness already. And all these instances of different emotional reactions through this whole interaction with the book were basically already building something like a basic narrative, emotional narrative about the activity of book sharing, about that, what is in the book. If we move on to jointly switching and jumping between routines, here we saw the combinatorial variation and switching parts between routines. So here, through doing that, so through encountering multiple routines and realizing that they are similar, that they have equivalent structures, there's further differentiation of action with equivalent sub-actions, which are transferable across routines. So here you can probably easily see also the model from linguistics with the parasyntagmatic, so syntagmatic and paradigmatic axis of what's understood there as a language system. But what I'm saying here is that I think that we have these we have these things of understanding chunks of things and relating them already in action and in interaction. And so from these, and we have here all small reflection points and decision points where the mother and infant decide where to go from one action at one point, where to go now, to which action shall we go now? And they're coordinating here. And this is basically the basis of kind of sharing a system or multiple action orientation and action systems together. And that's what I think happens in the next step, so that something emerges like a shared systemically structured sense and action scape. So here the idea is that now they are oriented together. If you're thinking about the boy with the mother and the bird, they are oriented in this space. And now the regulation happens via constantly co-creating and developing a kind of shared portable context, and orienting each other and affecting each other via self co-created coordinates. So for example, a word would be something like that, or also some movement which both of them have developed together as a kind of signal. And these coordinates are also part in a larger system. So they have their role in specific activities. They play specific roles in specific activities, and therefore the competence, this orientation competence, this of orienting together, takes this form of a system where they can orient, which is of course not imagined as being stuck in the head, but is something which they both constantly co-create and keep up. And the idea is that brings us a lot closer to these complex activities like language, symbol use, conventional object use, and so on. Okay, that was a very quick walkthrough. And thanks for your attention, and a huge thanks to the babies, to Tina Reichelt and Elisabeth Zimmermann for helping to collect the data. And of course also to my supervisors in Portsmouth, because this is a large part of my PhD work. So Vasu Reddy and Ellen Costal and Beatriz Lopez. And also we're continuing to work on this now, especially these issues of systematicity with Joanna Raszek-Leonardi, and Katharina Rolfing and Iris Domiko. So thanks for your attention, and I hope we have an interesting discussion, because I think so there wasn't so much theoretical grounding here, because I wanted to really focus on the empirical, share the empirical data. But I think there are very large, it's a very large overlap here to some of the work recently done in an activism. But I will just stop the screen sharing here and go to the discussion again.
That's wonderful.
Okay, so
Thanks,
yeah, as I said, I think there's a lot of connection to, for example, the paper Elena, Ezekiel, and Hanne have done to your work, of course, and all the problems of the scaling problem and so on. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. It's sort of a really rich bedrock there. But I think the data, just seeing that, well, one, it's just nice to watch baby videos under any circumstance, I think. But the concreteness of the example, I think, are really evocative. Can I just ask you to, so just to those viewing quickly, there's sort of a couple of ways in which you can raise questions for me to sort of pass along and to articulate. One is at ENSOL Seminars on Twitter, but also on the YouTube event page. There's a chat module just to the right of the main video. So if you include questions there, I'll be able to ask to present them to Nicole. So Nicole, I wonder if I could ask you to go into a little bit more detail, actually, just on the notion of coordinates that you finished up with there. So they sort of came up earlier on in the first complicated slide. Those complicated slides are great for me, actually, because it's nice to sort of break things up and have things, the information all there to sort of refer back and forward to as I was making sense of it. So is the coordinate kind of more of a cue that the context is about to change and it's time to switch to this different habit or routine? Or is it more, I guess this is not a mutually exclusive notion, which is, this is the routine we're in now. We're confirming what's already happening.
Yeah, and I haven't completely worked out the notion yet, but it arose out of the necessity to have a name for something where you take a little bit of a process of an action and you bring it close to activity going on to coordinate.
Okay. So is it so almost like we need to settle into a deeper attractor here? I'm going to use a coordinate to kind of push us down the.
So versus the cues in the beginning might be everything. So something dropping and the infant might look there, or events that happen anyway. So when infants, for example, watch their parents, they are just drawn by the parents empty the dishwasher. They are drawn by the cluttering dishes, for example. And but this is really, and it gets more and more so. This is this kind of when this string, this bit of action crystallizes as something that's used for coordination.
Okay.
And then which later on is more and more co-created.
Okay. So
very much the mothers are doing this, but they are then doing that together, shaping these little things together and more explicitly. Because in the beginning, these things just happen to work. But in the next steps and on the next level, you see that there is not only the coordination of coordination, but actually the coordination of coordinating coordination. Because it sounds a bit weird, but in the example, for example, with the baby crawling to the fireplace, so you see the baby is going there, but she doesn't actually want to go to that fireplace anymore. So the topic of the interaction has become the coordination with the mother.
She wants to be chased.
She wants to be chased.
Yeah.
And what they do is they vary this kind of coordination. And they somehow, so there's another reflection there in a way. So the topic is, how do you coordinate things? And how do we create the things which coordinate our interaction with the world? And I think things like language are very much such a thing.
Yeah.
Like, coordinate how we want to coordinate. In the beginning, we are thrown into the world in a way and react broadly to everything which happens. And this is more and more narrowed down, and we create our regulators ourselves.
Okay.
Negotiate how to.
So I think to me that makes sense of, or I guess I'm partly understanding that in terms of the differences of the kinds of the diagrams that you showed. So the overall arc, which has a lovely generic character to it in the sense that you can see it just that's the arc of the basic, the paradigmatic narrative from to build up. And
so like Privaten and Jonathan Delafield Batt using this kind of a basic narrative.
Right.
And I just rather use action arc because it's the action itself, and because in narrative there's this additional aboutness, which I think emerges from around 6 months. So that's
So in the first diagram of that, you had it sort of it was the pointillist version of the arc, so I guess maybe before coordinates emerge, or when you're in that early, when children are in the very early stage, it is just single events are happening that aren't necessarily part of a larger arc. It's just a child is responding to individual actions and events as pure once-off point events. But as they become capable of engaging over longer timescales, essentially coordination becomes necessary, and they also become sensitive to larger timescale coordinations of things. So I get coordinates are then how they make sense of that complexity of all the different branching points in a series of behaviors. Okay, so I think I'm getting it, which is good. Yes, very good, thank you. So that, I guess, sort of partly I had I have a whole bunch of other questions to be quite honest, but one that I really liked and was very curious about is a comment you made, which was on the two different versions of Peekaboo, which was they were both in the 4 to 6 month range, and you described particularly the second example where the child was playing with you, in terms of it being context independent. And so I'm just kind of curious as to, is that so precisely what you mean by context independent there, I guess? And is that the beginning, or what it felt like to me, I guess, was this notion that it's an ability, it's an origin or an example of early agency, of being able to create a new context.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so as I said, of course, we're never context independent, because of course we're always immersed in this rich material cultural contexts. But what I meant was, again, in the beginning, we're prone to be drawn everywhere. So
okay,
they have more agency and the stance of their own, and they're also not. So in the early peekaboo example, she's dependent on her mother handing her the blanket and responds to that. And here she already can, as you said, create the context herself. I mean, the blanket is there, but she doesn't use it only for peekaboo. She also uses it for going to sleep, but in a different way. But here she sees, okay, the blanket and me, and then she has somehow this idea, of creating this interaction together. And she's able to do that now because she has somehow the whole scope of the interaction is present.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I guess I have a sort of a follow on to that then, which may not be a coherent question. I may just be showing my ignorance, but I'm curious as to whether your data sort of make clear in this in any way, or whether it can even be teased apart as to whether that is essentially a skills-based development. That is, agency comes with being able to practice the skill, or is it a development, a broadly developmental phenomenon, such that somewhere in the 4 to 6 month range, agency starts to kick in and will be used in a number of different contexts?
That's of course a hard question, which I also can't really tell only from development. But the point is, it's just to show that all these things change or transform together.
Okay.
What also in a book sharing paper I've called it psychologies in transformation. So so it's to understand these things, or also perhaps where the change happens and how, that we have to look at the whole thing, so that we can't just assume, okay, this happens only in the head or this happens outside, but to look at, and it's really at the moment the strategy to understand how the coordination changes. And then we can ask, okay, what kind of abilities does this require? And how is the infant able to do that? And that will be further questions about how that works, or where the change happens.
Okay, so would you, or have you any intuition then as to whether many of these dynamics are essentially this? So if I take up a new hobby tomorrow, if I decide I want to take up pottery tomorrow, having never touched a potter's wheel or clay before, am I more or less starting from scratch? Is there, is this something that adults essentially are already always partway along the arc, or partway along that development?
Yeah, well, the idea is that at some point, infants come to the point where we don't have these singular skills, but we also have some action units. I don't know how to call them because it's very tricky, of course, but which are to our supply in a way. But of course, in the case of pottery, you still have to learn the But in general, so they are more, we have a kind of repertoire of actions we can employ in different contexts. And that's exactly the idea of this kind of systems emerging.
Okay.
Because I think a thing which we are still missing, or which we can complement in looking at this data, which happens between or which can help conceptually somehow target the field between the so-called base level interactions and higher cognitive functions. Yeah. But it's really a form of it's not something that happens in suddenly language occurs, but that might be something that actually happens in interaction.
So I guess whether infant or adult, you're bringing a set of resources to any given situation, and then it's a question of how do those resources get assembled into a coordinated action. It's a lovely, it's the scale invariance of it is lovely and very very evocative, I think, as well, and telling, I suspect. Well, then I might be biased on that. But no, I had another question, but I've lost it in my notes here. Oh yeah, so that I had, the other question is actually kind of a little bit more banal, which is sort of getting back to the methodology and how you decided what behaviors to record. So because it looks like obviously there are sort of a number of different research projects that you're synthesizing a range of different things from here.
Yeah, so it was, I was very broadly looking at everyday interactions, because mostly our knowledge on especially development of social cognition and so on is mostly focused on very few contexts. So photo conversation for early interactions or for late interactions labeling and so on. But since the contexts are very different, which an infant is immersed in, the idea was they might afford very different forms of coordination. And so we were looking broadly at everyday life interactions, different ones, and try to find out. So that's one of the projects, also to try to find out how a specific contexts affords a specific form of coordination. So, and for this, I then took the context. So book sharing was one I focused on early, because it was such a surprise that it happens from 3 months, and it's thought to be this high-level, cultural, complicated activity. So, oh, how can that be? So that was one model activity, and then I tried to compare it to other activities as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the nappy changing and the other sort of that. Okay. So was there any sort of deliberate attempt to examine the time scale issue explicitly, or essentially did that just arise from the way that the interactions changed over time?
It arose mostly from how the interactions changed, and also, of course, then working with the literature and seeing that again we have a lot for low, so concepts also for the low level things. So like rhythm or the idea of contingency, responding to contingency and so on. But we don't have, and we have on the other side, we have these kind of like scripts and sequences of events, but they don't mean a lot to the infants yet. And so therefore there's this gap in concepts of how to actually conceptualize the regulation going on here. And then I realized in all the videos, I realized then this emotional action arc, and then there was the idea, oh, that might be actually the middle part, the bridge to bridge these levels to make it meaningful for the infant, and also make it shared from the beginning, because they're literally physically going together.
It's I mean I love the notion of it, just that that sort of layered timescales of kind of the slower progression of mood gathering or helping to gather and coordinate the faster moving individual behaviors and so on.
And it's also mostly, so the idea, I mean, the idea is around for a long time. Also, of course, from Stern had this idea of the vitality contours, but funnily, it wasn't ever linked to organizing the action, but it was seen, or it's most often seen as, being a kind of emotional exchange.
Okay.
Rather than having.
So it was a running commentary on how things were going, rather than something that actually helped coordinate the behavior. Okay.
Exactly. It was for sharing effect. But
right.
So there was this distinction again between cognitive content and affect or everything else that might be going. It's
a little bit disturbing sometimes just how psychopathic cognitive science gets by times, as though it's sort of all of that emotional stuff, we'll push that off to one side, that's clearly a mess, but here we'll work this rational bit. But yeah, and okay, there's a really rich set of sort of data and studies here, which I know it's going to take a bit of time to properly digest. So all of that then fits, I guess, within. Is there an evolutionary aspect to the sort of evolutionary model in the sense that you have these kind of early, broad, quasi-adaptive orientations which gradually get refined by the effectiveness of the feedback loops as a kind of a fitness function, or is that being too algorithmic? I don't know.
I don't at the moment dare to speculate about that.
I guess it just looks like there are kind of thematic relationships with either looking at it as some kind of evolutionary process, or more specifically as a behavior shaping process, really kind of almost Skinnerian kind of a dynamic systems sensitive Skinnerian view. I don't know. I'm sure there are any behavior analysts watching will be desperately upset by my butchering of the complexity of Skinnerian philosophy there, but nevertheless, very good. Yeah, no, so I haven't got a sort of any specific questions through on Twitter there, but I think there will be opportunities to continue the discussion through the ENSO Seminars webpage. So the event page for the seminar has a forum beneath it that we often see things kick off there, and the discussion to follow on from that, because there's a lot to interrogate here. We actually have Johanna coming up as one of the ENSO speakers, hopefully in the new year. So we might get a sort of direct sequel. Yeah, so I think that's definitely something to look forward to. I'm very grateful for you having taken the time to present the seminar for us. And as I say, I think I'm gonna throw myself into the literature now. I think there's a lot to dig in and rewarding there. So thank you very much for your time, Nicole.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts, and so looking forward hopefully to some conversations unfolding from here.
Very good.
So
okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, and we'll see you all for an ENSO seminar next month. Okay, bye now.